All right, so what is agenda setting theory? Agenda setting theory explains that the volume of news drives salience of political issues. So what does this mean in real life? It means that, basically speaking, the more you report or write or the more you cover something in the news, the more salient this issue will be in public opinion. The first agenda setting study has been conducted in the 70s, and it showed that the more newspapers cover certain political candidates and certain political issues, the more people believe those issues matter. And it's pretty interesting because the original agenda setting hypothesis stated that media influence not what people think, but what they think about. So basically, the early agenda setting studies found out that maybe mass media can't tell you what to think about this candidate or this political issue, but they can definitely make sure that this issue will be on your mind. And that's pretty important because how do we decide what's important and what's not, what's salient and what's not? So agenda setting theory tries to explain that through the effect of mass media on public opinion by hypothesizing that mass media can suggest for us as people or as voters what issues are really important and which issues are not. And again, this applies to both mass and elite opinion, which means that mass media can affect not only what ordinary people think or regular voters, but it also can affect what political leaders think, what political parties think, what people in Congress think, and so on. So mass media, according to this theory, have the subtle effect of telling people what issues really matter. Moving on to the next slide. What were the major findings of mass media studies? The first one, probably the most general and major conclusion we can make out of the whole mass media agenda setting research tradition, is that there is indeed significant short-term shifts in issue salience. So this basically means that it is true, the more something is covered in the news, the more people will think this issue really matters. It's salient. And the second general finding that you can find in a lot of mass media papers is that media effects were detected over and above effects of real-world cues. Again, this sounds pretty official, but what it means in real life? It means that above and beyond everything we come across in our real life, we still will learn something from mass media. So basically, maybe you have an uncle in your family that has certain political beliefs. Maybe your friends have those beliefs too. Maybe you come across certain issues in your real life, and of course all that shapes your opinion. But on top of that, above and beyond those real-life effects, mass media will still be able to communicate what issues are salient. And that's pretty important because it shows that people actually do learn about issue saliency from mass media, which means that mass media do have a direct effect on public opinion. So as a future mass media practitioner, it's important to realize that whatever work you create, it is going to affect public opinion. It's going to affect your viewers or readers. Moving on to the next slide. A few agenda setting research methods. I'm not going to go too deep into that because that's pretty much a whole separate conversation. But just to explain what I'm talking about when I say they conducted research or they compared news coverage and public opinion. How is it done? The most common way to conduct agenda setting research, and that methodology was developed by the agenda setting theory founders, McCombs and Shaw, Maxwell McCombs and Donald Shaw. Basically, it's a pretty straightforward methodology. How do we know that whatever is covered in the news actually affects people? Of course, first we need to read the news, right? So we select all the articles or, let's say, TV packages related to a certain topic during a certain time frame, and we calculate how often a certain issue was mentioned in the news coverage. Then we create a survey and we ask ordinary people what issues they think are important right now. So we write down those numbers and then we correlate the frequencies. So let's say the issue of human rights came up in the news within the past 2 months, and if we talk about a certain number of TV channels or newspapers, we say they mentioned 1,000 times they mentioned human rights. It's just a hypothetical example. Then we create a survey and we write down how many people said they think human rights is an important issue. And we do the same for multiple issues in the society, like economy, natural disasters, ecological environment, or women's rights, right? So we can write down multiple issues like that and rank them from the most common or popular to the least common and popular. And then we correlate those two data sets. If we find out that they do indeed correspond, so for example, the more common an issue is in news coverage, the more common and popular it will be in public opinion, then we can say that we just documented the agenda setting effect, because the media set the agenda for the public. So the media actually affected the public opinion. And that's pretty much the basic idea behind the methodology of agenda setting research. And it really helps scientists to document the effect mass media have on people, which again, if we talk about the real hands-on sort of mass media experience, it translates to the realization that whatever you create as a journalist, reporter, as a documentary filmmaker, any mass media practitioner, really, it does affect the society. So that's a great responsibility, and that's what we learn from research. Moving on to the next slide. So what can affect those agenda setting effects? Remember, we spoke about minimal consequences. The idea that mass media do not largely affect everybody just like one huge propaganda machine, but instead mass media have subtle, more unnoticeable, more sophisticated effects, and that's what it's all about. So just because mass media cover something very frequently, it doesn't necessarily mean that you as a reader or TV viewer will automatically accept that agenda and believe that this is what's really salient. There are some conditioning factors here, and that all we again know from research. So just a few conditioning factors. The less involved and less informed people are more likely to be affected by media effects. What does it mean? It means that the less you know, the more likely you will believe the media, basically. I'm oversimplifying this idea just to illustrate it and make it clear. So basically, based on what we saw in research, the less involved and people that don't know that much about the current situation or issue were more likely to accept that agenda from the media instead of doing their own research. Another conditioning factor was personal sensitivity to issues. So let's say I really care about women's rights because I personally experienced that in my life. And then I see media coverage related to Women's March in Washington, D.C. I will be more likely to remember about what I saw just because I'm personally sensitive to this issue. I care about this issue on a personal level. And it pretty much, you can translate this example and compare it to any other issue just the same way. So basically what we've learned from research is that if the issue is personally relatable to us, we're more likely to be susceptible to mass media effects on public opinion, and specifically agenda setting effects. Then the third conditioning factor, effects limited to real national problems, of course, are way more significant. So what does this mean? This means that if we talk about problems that don't really exist in the current community, people are not likely to think they're salient anyway, no matter how often you cover them. But if you, as a media practitioner, cover issues pretty often, and those issues actually do exist in the current community, and people really do experience them in their daily life, and they care about them, this means that mass media coverage will have a significantly larger potential to affect people. So simply speaking, of course, people are more likely to care about something that exists in their community rather than just some general issue they don't come across. And then the last conditioning factor, where a story is placed. Surprisingly, it actually matters. For example, if you put a story on the cover page of the newspaper, it has a significantly larger chance of setting the agenda for the readers than if you put it somewhere at the back of the newspaper in tiny font. And it's pretty funny because little things like that actually matter for the effects on public opinion. How large is the font, how much space it occupies, whether there's a picture or not, whether the headline is large enough to notice, whether the story is on the front cover of the newspaper. All those little details that we might consider just mere technical peculiarities, they actually do affect to what extent people will get the agenda from mass media as well. All right, moving on to the next slide. One example is the case of crime, a very clear and straightforward example of how media can set the agenda for people. So on this diagram, on this illustration on the screen, you can see two statistics. The blue line is the percentage of people in the survey that identified crime as the most important problem facing the nation. And then the gray line is the actual crime rate per 100,000 people in the population. And look how wide is the gap between these two statistics. So basically, the gray line is the actual crime rate in the community. The dark blue line is the percentage of people that believe that crime is very significant in their community. And just look at that really wide gap between these two numbers, or two statistics, across different years, all the way from 1994 till 2012. The gap is pretty significant, but what's even more important is that starting with 1994, crime was actually going down. But look at people's beliefs about how bad crime is. It has nothing to do with reality. So let's say crime was actually going down, but in 1999, people's beliefs that crime is a serious issue in their community was an all-time high for this time frame, which shows that there's something else that contributes to our belief what actually is a big problem in our community, besides reality. Because reality showed consistent decline of crime, but that's not what people believed in. And of course, that shows this agenda-setting effect. This shows that there's something above and beyond reality that persuades, or I shouldn't use the word persuade, that affects people's opinion about what's going on in their community. And of course, mass media coverage has contributed a lot to that. If all you see on television is crime reports, it doesn't matter what the actual crime rate is, it will automatically increase your probability of thinking that crime is a very salient issue in your community. And again, I'm oversimplifying here just as an example, but that's essentially what agenda-setting effect is. When media transfer onto public opinion the ideas about what issues matter and which issues are the most salient that you can see in the community. Okay, moving on to the next slide. So agenda-setting effects, essentially that's the reason why candidates and campaigns and commercial companies care so much about their image in the media. Because whatever people see in the media has a significant chance of affecting public opinion. So we know that from research, and that's exactly why mass media and mass communication research needs to be conducted. And it's not only conducted by scholars, but now in the 21st century, it's also conducted by commercial research companies. Because if you want to get elected, if you want people to buy your product, if you want to succeed as a company, you need to know what the population thinks about you as a company or as a political candidate. So besides that, later agenda-setting research has shown that not only media communicate to people what issues are salient, but they also communicate to people what attributes are salient. So actually, despite the early agenda-setting belief, media can tell people to some extent what to think about those candidates and companies and other stakeholders. And it's pretty significant because essentially media can make voters associate particular features with a candidate's or a company's name. And this can define advertising outcome or the outcome of political campaign. So it doesn't matter whether you create content for a commercial company, whether you create content for a political candidate, whether you create content for mass media outlets or news stations. Essentially, it has a pretty interesting effect on public opinion. And again, whenever you create that content, it's a really good thing to think about and remember about, because whatever you create as a mass media practitioner has very serious implications in real world, and it affects your readers and viewers.